Good afternoon. We're going to call this take two of my attempted read along of the All Dead Generations blog article. So, you want to build a dungeon? If you were here yesterday, and thanks if you were, I had I had hardware issues. My week of issues continued. Hardware issues. I happened to notice offhand as I looked down, probably looking at the time or something, that my battery I was half on battery power and down to 50%. My laptop is sort of in the gas guzzling category of laptops. So I knew that 50% wasn't going to get me too far. And then I don't know if it's just that the meter's not accurate, but the whole thing went dead when I was hovering over. I was about 8 or 9%. I was trying to just quickly wrap things up in a usual Todd Hex Press fashion. I was probably being overly long-winded and like blam, just cut out at about, it looked like it was about 8% left on the battery, just gonzo. Now, nothing asks, which is a very good question. How much power do I have today? Today I am back fully on plugged-in power. I am at 100%. I was offhand. I was kind of trying to figure out. I don't know if my laptop. I don't think my laptop can go USB power, but I'm not sure because I do remember kind of looking at that. It was one of the things I wanted. I was kind of eyeballing when I bought this laptop a couple years ago. It has USB-C, which I was keen on. It has some other features that I really wanted. And I don't remember if I ended up kind of giving up on the USB power. Of course, when something like that happens, it makes me regret it because if I'd been able to switch to USB power, that would have been pretty darn painless. But I didn't have it. Thankfully, it did turn out that my power brick wasn't failing. There was just I have a couple of I have sort of an extension cord that's running into a surge protector that this thing's plugged into, and one of those cords was just a touch loose. The weirdest thing was I have other things plugged into that same surge protector, and the surge protector was showing like it was on, and other things were powered. But it must be that there's the energy needs of the laptop. It wasn't hitting that kind of critical point, and it was just it's a little smidge unplugged, and that was enough to cause everything to go awry. I just couldn't really. While I was on the stream, I was trying to keep things focused here, which meant I wasn't looking around. After the computer died, I was able to. I did kind of start fishing around, and then look, this is just a tiny bit unplugged. And when I plugged it in, look at that, my power brick light came on. So we're back. That's right, walking the path. We're back, baby. We are back. I thought about whether I should just start from the middle, start over. I'm just going to start over again. Clean, fresh from the top. That way we get one nice, good run through, and don't have one half that ends super abruptly and is also filled with lots of oh gosh, my power supply is failing talk, and we can concentrate on the content. I'm going to start from the beginning. Apologies if it's a little bit repetitive, but that's what I decided to do, and gosh darn it, I'm going to do that. So we're back to the post from last March. So you want to build a dungeon. Posted on the All Dead Generations blog. I will post this link into the chat again. Hey, Terrence. Yep, missed a truncated episode. No problem. I am here for you. So you want to build a dungeon. There's the link. It's in the chat. Let's get to reading. You want to write a dungeon adventure for a classic style role-playing game, and you want it to be good. How does that work? What exactly does a dungeon imply, and what is it as a game tool? A dungeon is a specific kind of adventure, one that has its own form and which requires certain elements to be successful. More, a dungeon is a location-based adventure, an adventure that will involve the exploration of a fictional space room by room. It's certainly not the only kind of role-playing adventure, but it's the primary kind for a particular exploration, navigation, and problem-solving style of play that is both the oldest and still a compelling one. A dungeon must be a fantastical location, but it need not be an underground maze or cave system. Buildings, shipwrecks, space stations, castles, formal gardens, or the corpses of an enormous beast all make fine dungeons. What is necessary for a dungeon adventure is to create a bounded fantastical space, rooms linked together in some order that the players can freely navigate, backtracking, turning, and determining routes. Within these rooms, the designer places obstacles and rewards. Traditionally, this means a series of set of stone corridors and chambers filled with monsters, treasures, and traps. However, neither the aesthetic of the space or the nature of the inhabitants, valuables, and challenges within are fixed elements of design, and reinterpreting the dungeon space can make for a novel and exciting adventure. Likely, when you decide to write an adventure, you already had a story in mind. And that's good, but since location-based adventure is about the player's decisions, that story will recede into the background. Given freedom to scheme and explore, players are as inventive and truculent as a proverbial herd of cats, and trying to force or trick them into telling a specific story is about as successful as ringmastering a cat's circus. Rather than a story, consider your ideas a theme, one that will inform the ecology and a layout or map that together define the dungeon adventure. Putting a plot to it is likely to fail when the players, unaware of the plot, follow their own interests. This is the joy and burden of location-based classic dungeon crawling, that its story has to evolve from player decision. The most dangerous part of a designer's story is a climax or ending because it's very hard to include one without making dangerous compromises to the dungeon adventure form. Narrative beats make assumptions about how the characters within a story will act, and become very difficult to maintain when those characters' decisions are being made by someone other than the author. Players' decision-making is unlikely to bind itself to even as simple a narrative structure: incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Players may decide that they wish to avoid the climax confrontation by siding with the antagonist, or they may simply turn away from the rising action as they become distracted or the risk seems too high and the rewards uninteresting. Instead, the dungeon designer is best building only the space for a story to unfold and relying on the players to determine the narrative within that story. Terrence said, Cat Circus Ringmaster is basically my GMing style. Yeah, I mean, for what you've told me, Terrence, that sounds about right. Space is the central fact. The first question of dungeon design is space. Before a designer can address the themes and story of a fantastic location, they should consider the game mechanics of the location itself, to think of it as a board or arena for play. Space takes time to traverse, and in a classic role-playing game, time embodies risk. Random encounters, torches running down, exhaustion, and increased distance from the safety of the entrance. Thus, a dungeon requires a layout, some way of structure the rooms of the dungeon that gives players choices about how they will navigate them, but is of a scope and complexity when those choices are meaningful. Traditionally, and still most effectively, the layout is organized and shown with a map. Drawing a map is easy enough, but still raises the question of what kind of map. Thinking about maps is thinking about space and time, and not just fictional time. Consider the time you and your players have to devote to the game. A party role-playing game explorers using a reasonably light rule set moves through roughly 3 to 5 rooms per hour of play, assuming 1 to 2 encounters or other obstacles in those rooms and a reasonable level of detail to poke at. For a one-session, 2 to 4 hour game, a dungeon of 8 to 12 rooms should be sufficient. While multi-session games can utilize larger dungeons, these time constraints are still important because they help determine the limits of one session's worth of exploration, and so the placement of entrances and exits. Just going to pause here for a moment. I don't know these numbers. How do these numbers sound to people? I've never really thought about how many rooms or something in a day. I mean, if these numbers are at all accurate, it's really interesting. It'd be a great thing to know because it's giving some nice, I don't know, backgrounds or some nice, maybe just parameters to shoot at. So if I am building a dungeon that's I really just want it to be kind of a one session thing, then 8 to 12 rooms. Or if I want it to be 2 sessions, then maybe I double that to 24, something like that. I'd be curious to know what people's experiences are. I haven't really heard these numbers he throws out there, like they're kind of well known and just obvious or established, or almost standard. And I don't know that's true, but I don't really know at all. But if they are, more, and of course, there's always going to be a range, but more or less true for the average group, the average blah blah blah. It would be good to know as to have that to kind of ballpark how big your dungeon is from a meta time commitment aspect. This basic scope is important because it gives the designer expectations and guidelines for size and complexity. Too much complexity or too many rooms, and the players will never be able to make meaningful progress in the adventure or understand the layout. Too few rooms and too little complexity, and the adventure risks not offering many choices, reducing play to a predictable set of scenes and encounters. After establishing the basic scope of the layout, there's plenty of specifics to contemplate, and RPG cartography has its own complex set of arguments, maxims, and strong opinions. However, basic tips for designing usable dungeon maps include: avoid linear maps. Branches, loops, verticality, secret doors, rooms with multiple entrances and exits all make the map of your dungeon a puzzle that players can solve. Consider the size and scope. Add empty rooms to create space when needed, and rather than a single sprawling location, consider sublevels or nodes of 10 to 30 rooms each. Place multiple entrances and exits, especially if the dungeon is larger. Use locked gates, trapdoors, chutes, and secret doors to make discovering these exits and their relationship to the dungeon itself a reward. Verticality is a traditional way to break up regions or levels, but it's harder to use within individual rooms as it can be difficult for the GM to describe complex spaces. Multi-level rooms and oddly shaped rooms are best used sparingly. Symmetry is risky. While it can be a useful tool for hinting at secret spaces and encouraging player comprehension of a map, it also can lead to dull and linear maps. Before relying on it, consider both the fictional reasons for the symmetry, how it will affect play, and that in real architecture, most symmetry is only partial. Most importantly, the map of your dungeon should have an internal logic. Placement of rooms should make sense both fictionally and spatially. Throne room should be large and accessible through an opulent antechamber and guard room, not a kitchen or waste dump. Walking the Path says, yeah, 12 is the max for me for one session. Brian Smith says, not sure how they could come up with a universal average without aggregating lots of sessions. That's a good point, Brian Smith. I mean, I don't know that they calculated this themselves. We don't know where this data comes from. Or we only seen the kind of the summary of some hidden data set or sets that says that 8 to 12 for one session. So who knows? I mean, that's part of it. I don't know where the number's coming from. There's no footnote to, oh, by the way, this comes from data, whether it's just old anecdotal polling or their individual experiences, or I imagine something like Roll20. Could you, I don't even know, maybe for official modules, could they even have something like timing through different areas in something like Roll20 to kind of determine play times? That's why I'm kind of curious about the number. It's a nice number and it sounds good, and maybe it does work for the majority of people. I just hadn't heard one thrown out there, and it's thrown out there with such assurance, which is interesting. Terrence says, I hardly have the luxury of running rules light games, so I can't comment on those averages. Yep. And then Nothing says, I'm not sold on room counts per session. It depends so much what's in the rooms, but thinking about how big a dungeon you should make for a session is a good exercise. Yes, Nothing. I don't know. And it's kind of also interesting, or when you think about those 8 to 12 rooms, is it 8 to 12 rooms total? Is it 8 to 12 rooms that are explored? Because in any dungeon, there's going to be a number of rooms in it, and then there's going to be something probably less than 100% that the party actually gets to in a given session. Maybe there's a party that just goes and sort of like clockwork and just hits every single room. If they have the time and resources to do it, I suppose they might. Oftentimes you're making choices. We're going to go, we have 2 hallways. We can go left or right. We go down one, which means we might not going to hit the rooms on the other side. So is that 8 to 12 rooms visited, and we should probably build out 24, knowing that maybe half the rooms won't get visited? Or is this saying that you're going to have 12 rooms and the players are only going to hit 8, or you have 8 rooms and they're only going to hit 6 or 4 or some other number? Again, we don't know. Don't know. Hey, Marcello, how are you? Brian Smith says, they say you can't really rely on what players will do, then state the average like it's always true. Yeah, this is true, though. It's kind of that thing. I don't know what the name of it is, but I know there's something. I think it's a statistical concept, which I think is true, which is basically that individual people, we don't know anything. But when you poll lots of people, it actually, I'm probably confusing this. So I believe that the situation came up with, say, guess the amount of jelly beans in some massive mason jar. Individually, people are going to come up with guesses that are all over the map that are not dependable to be even close to whatever the actual total is. But apparently, if you poll thousands of people and you kind of average all those numbers out, at the end of the day, that 1,000 people end up getting pretty close. That individually, we may not have some great accuracy in our individual answers, but when taken as a big group, we actually do get fairly accurate answers. And maybe it's something like that. No, you can't predict what any individual group can do, but we can predict, and it's really just time. It's not about how they're interacting or what they're doing. It's simply the time spent. So when he's talking about you can't predict what players can do, he's saying stuff like, in a room, in a situation, we don't know if the players are going to side with the bad guy, side with the good guy, decide to just close the door and go somewhere else. That's not what they're saying in terms of the time. The time spent, all that stuff counts as the same amount of time. If the whole session could still take 2.5 hours in this, say, our 12-room dungeon, even if different groups do completely different things. So I don't think it's quite as contradictory as maybe it seems when you pull those quotes out of context, if you will. Walk in the Past says, "Oh, wasn't there a movement to limit dungeons to 5 rooms?" I wouldn't call it a movement. It's called the 5-room dungeon, and it's not really. They don't mean rooms as in literally rooms. It's more about having areas in your dungeon that are thematic, and then using the thematic part instead of the mapping part. And what I mean by that is, instead of looking at the space and navigating through it in that sort of way, it would be like, I'm trying to explain this. If we had a labyrinth, okay, one way to run a labyrinth would be to lay it out, have it down, and say, okay, we're going to go left and right, then left and right, whatever, and then they're going to navigate and make their way through it. Another way to do it would maybe to look at it in a way that's more abstracted and say, hey, you're in the labyrinth. What tools do you use to navigate the labyrinth? And one player says, okay, we're going to use left-hand turns, and we're going to keep going left. And someone else says, and then we're going to use chalk, and we're going to put our marks down, and with all that stuff. And it almost becomes, in a sense, you could say a skill challenge. It doesn't have to be that way, but it could be a skill challenge, all these things. And then you do enough stuff, and you get to the end of the labyrinth. Either just fictionally, you come up with enough tools that defeat the labyrinth, that maybe as a GM, you go, okay, yeah, well, now that you're moving left, and that's going to take care of these problems, and now you're doing this, you've kind of, all the things they're going to get you lost. You're using string or chalk or something else. You're defeating the maziness part of the labyrinth. So, okay, you make it through, and maybe it takes X amount of time or Y amount of time, something like that. You could say the same thing for if we wanted to talk about moving through a set of offices. We could talk about, okay, left to your right, there are office doors 10 feet down, another set of office doors 20 feet down. It looks like a conference room. Or you can simply talk about that whole space and then just allow the players to kind of move freely within that whole thematic space of offices and not be so concerned about their literal position on a grid or something. And that's kind of where the 5-room dungeon, and I forget exactly the 5 rooms, but their sort of entranceway, they're sort of, and the other thing that's thematic in the 5-room dungeons is kind of about the kind of problems you face. So the entranceway, usually they talk about having some kind of obstacle to getting in. What is the obstacle? Whether it could be environmental, it could be social, it could be combat, and then you have another part that fulfills another sort of narrative thematic sense. And then so on and so forth. So it's a different way of organizing it. They're basically saying, we're going to abstract out the physical location and talk about these thematic elements and build our dungeons that way. Hopefully that makes some sense. Maybe someone in the chat, if they're not too busy, has a link to one of the 5-room dungeon pages. You could drop that in the chat so I don't have to try to look it up. And yes, as Elfbait says, a 5-room dungeon could definitely be multiple sets of 5 rooms. You can nest them. It's very similar to that when we read that article on that video game design. It had very much a 5-room dungeon vibe where it was essentially abstracting out. I mean, in the video game sense, they were using their procedural engine to create the physical spaces, but in terms of the triggers and kind of how they were thinking about these spaces, it had a 5-room dungeon vibe in terms of thinking about thematically, mechanically, what are these aspects doing? So you might take a castle and you say, we have the gate, the portcullis that's down, that would be that entranceway, and that has that kind of challenge. Then maybe you get in the dungeon or in the castle, and you might think about in the courtyard. Maybe there's this kind of element to it that we are testing their navigation, or we're testing their social skills, or maybe we were testing combat, and then the inner sanctum then becomes where the sort of main boss of this location is, kind of thing. It's just a different way of thinking about it. It's certainly useful, even if you don't end up wanting to use it. I think they can open up new pathways of how to think about your dungeon spaces. All right, let's see what's going on in the chat. Brian Smith says, maybe it is more reliable to tie rooms to playtime when assuming everything happens in specific time increments in a game and wandering monsters and such. I mean, maybe. Elfbait says, a good way to think about it is sort of like scenes. Each set of 5 can be considered a cohesive part of the dungeon that collectively form the whole dungeon. Right. And it is kind of like thinking of dungeons in kind of a narrative way. in that sort of a hero's journey. You might talk about how you have sort of the dungeoneer's journey, and you're kind of thinking about that journey, and the physicalness of the spaces is not as important. You're not really worried about where you are on the grid or which rooms you're exploring. It's more important that you explore so many rooms, or you kind of take so many actions, as opposed to entering, what each individual room technically has. You can think about things in a more abstracted way, basically, and plan it out. And you can do both, because you can certainly use the five room thing to think about the thematic part, and then still actually map out your dungeons. Like I said, it's really an interesting tool that can be used a lot of different ways. But I think it began as thinking about dungeons that you could run kind of very low prep light systems in which you didn't have the time or space to draw out a dungeon, but you still wanted to run them through a kind of a location. How could you do that? And I think that was, in a sense, was an answer to that question, or at least one answer. No story, only theme? Really? No story. Not really. Any location has a story, a history that informs the situation the players find when they explore. There is just no story for how the adventure within the location will unfold. Some events or endings are more likely than others, but the game master, and especially the designer, can't depend on those likely conclusions to the adventure, because it's the player's adventure, and the players are unpredictable. Instead, the designer can set the situation, define the goals and personalities of the other actors, NPCs or monsters within the adventure, a distinction isn't helpful here, and describe the backdrop. Situations. Building a compelling initial situation is as much a part of adventure writing as designing a good map, but without underpinning knowledge, without some poised narrative energy, pent up and ready to be released by player interaction, it will be hard to visualize and incorporate that situation. A good location-based adventure may start in equipoise, with a situation more or less static, but ready to tip into disaster and action with player interference. Developing situations are also possible, but much trickier, as they need to be built into the campaign as a whole, typically with a countdown, clock, or index mechanic, something far beyond the scope of a single location's design. The history of the location and the stories of its denizens will set your initial situation, define the spatial layout, and influence the outcomes of the adventure. However, this information is not especially useful to either players or game master on its own. How the past impacts the present that the characters find themselves exploring matters, but the intricate details of a location's history are largely unnecessary to run an adventure. Backstory is somewhat inevitable when building the location in your mind, but it's not something that needs to be passed on to the reader. Backstory often detracts from usability, both by taking up space better spent on more accessible details, complicating the layout, and by adding information that may make it harder for a game master to incorporate the adventure into their own game. However, minimalism and the elimination of all history or backstory is as much a poor design decision as too much. Backstory helps the designer build the location, defining what spaces are, how they are used in the present, and why they were built. It informs the attitude, relationships, and nature of the location's inhabitants, the ecology, and can give the players clues about puzzles and obstacles within the location. Most importantly, it defines the description and aesthetics of the location, its theme. Theme evolves naturally from the designer's efforts to conceptualize a location, its history, and the present situation, and spell out its details. But you shouldn't waste it on an introduction that the players won't read and the game master is likely to skim and forget during play. Instead, backstory, history, and aesthetic theme offer something that the designer can build into description and use to define their adventure as different from others. Maps, monster statistics, and other mechanical aspects of location design won't vary too much between similar adventures, but the theme can. Saturating a location with a consistent aesthetic and repeated theme improves an adventure by making it easier to visualize, sticking in the mind, and filling out details. For the game master, theme makes expanding the necessary limited descriptions of the rooms easier by fixing an overall aesthetic, present situation in the mind that the game master can borrow from to answer unexpected questions. For the players, a theme offers consistency, allowing better visualization of the space and so greater ability to invest or think up unexpected solutions. A game master operating with a well-defined theme will find it easy to describe details and expand on descriptions, giving the players more knowledge and tools to act inside the fiction. Players will also develop expectations and knowledge about a theme, making them better able to decode what's out of place and recognize clues. The uses of history. Rumors and hooks almost always incorporate history and backstory. They represent clues to the location of treasures, the nature of obstacles, or the goals of the opposition within a location. Build evidence and background stories into the location descriptions rather than relaying it to the game master, They're useful only in as far as the players can discover them. History defines the appearance of a location, layout, building material, state of repair, existence, or type of secret doors and traps. Moreover, it gives the players clues to them. Murals, carvings, graffiti, and detritus are all defined by history and backstory, and they encourage player investigation while creating a sense of a living space. History and background stories help make the goals and attitudes of a location's inhabitants more plausible and transparent. All right. Oh, there's my first spam of the day. You are blocked, Spamio. Okay, I guess Marcello, are you talking about the 5-room dungeon? The author being John 4 with John with 2 N's wrote about 5-room dungeons. I like the usage of history. I agree with most of it. I think. I mean, I agree with. I agree. I would say that's probably my thing with most of everything. Is I probably agree with 9/10 of what they're saying. I think sometimes there's maybe a little bit more wiggle room, but I also understand that you're trying to be. You're coming out essentially with kind of a, I don't want to say a bold statement, but as part of it, you're trying to be not be too wishy-washy, right? I think there are times where you can build a narrative stuff, and plenty of people have. It's not necessarily the way I like to plan dungeons, but I think you can. I think there will always be wiggle room, because if you build something to be, here's the room with the climax where the players fight the boss and then they don't fight the boss, sure. But you can build up things. I think that's often done with certain rooms in a dungeon that you're funneled into. And those can have kind of narrative moments that can represent the situation deteriorating in some way or changing in some way and shifting and kind of pushing that. And through that, you kind of tell, in a sense, a story. And I think that's used a lot in modules where there'll be all kinds of free-floating stuff, and then you'll get to whatever room, and the description of that room will have something that happens as soon as the players get there, or when the players get here, this is happening, right? So when you're reading it as the GM, it's like this event is frozen in time, and then the players open the door, and it all kind of happens. And I don't particularly like that, because it seems kind of lame, and it doesn't really means that anything happening in there is not taking into account whatever the party's doing outside that room. But it is something that's done, and it is something that you can kind of do successfully, because in the moment, the players don't really know the difference between what's happening that's truly dynamic and what's happening because the module or whatever, the adventure just said it's happening now. So it can fail, but it can be done. Oh, there's spam number 2. Oh my gosh. They didn't come yesterday when I was having all my issues, but they're here now. Okay. On to ecology. With layout and theme, all that's left is a greater focus on the inhabitants of your dungeon and the ways they will interact with the party, each other, and the space itself. This dungeon ecology is, as mentioned in the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide, a fantastical one which needs to be comprehensible, not scientifically functional. Food chains and creature territories are useful, but the point is not to simulate a fictional world with rigorous fidelity. Instead, the goal is to create a web of plausible and recognizable connections between the creatures and the space of your dungeon that players can observe, understand, and exploit. The most obvious and useful of these are the relationships among inhabitants of the location, its quote-unquote factions. Factions. Beyond continuing the aesthetic coherence brought by a good theme, ecology includes the relationships of predator and prey, or tyrant and underclass, among the inhabitants. For these stories and relationships to matter, they must be something the players can see and exploit. Within factional relationships, there's room and even a need for story. But again, the details of the past are less important than a present that the adventurers can interact with. Details such as the reasons for factional animosity are useful at times, especially as they offer information that players can capitalize on when they inevitably become enmeshed in faction politics and struggle. The most important are the power relations and attitudes between the location factions, the nature of their leaders, and what they will demand to work with the adventurers. While it's common to think of factions as other groups of intelligent and organized creatures within a location, this need not be. A faction can be an individual creature, either a powerful predator or even a weaker creature whose very lack of power makes them an almost natural asset for the adventurers. Likewise, factions need not be intelligent. Packs of animals or a single dangerous beast can define the relationships between the inhabitants of a location, and their goals and reactions to adventurers are useful to consider. Nor do factions have to be native to the location. Rival adventuring parties or other intruders may also contest the player's goals within a location and offer enemies allies, or simply complications. To design the ecology of a location, one should consider any inhabitant or likely intruder whose existence and plans can disrupt the location's present situation and offer advice on how they may interact with the player's characters, even if it's straightforward. All right, let me just get a swig of water here. Reskinning isn't just for creatures, though. Oh, whoops, I jumped a paragraph. Reskinning. A difficulty in creating a useful dungeon ecology that still follows a specific theme can be the nature of the inhabitants. While there are hundreds of monster manuals and bestiaries, it's sometimes hard to find a pre-written creature that fits the appropriate level of the adventures, feels at home in the particular space, and has the abilities and goals to match the factional structure and aesthetic. While inventing new creatures is one of the great joys of adventure design, the process itself can be daunting, especially in a more complex system. Instead, it's often easier to use the stats from an existing well-known creature and simply describe it differently. A goblin can have the same statistics as an angry villager or a puckish, unheimlich fae. When this reskinning doesn't feel quite right, slight adjustments or swapping special abilities can usually fill in any discrepancies. A pig beast might be stated as a mountain lion with more HP, the cat's leap becoming a boar charge, or as a bear without claw attacks and its hug mechanic, replaced with a charge mechanic. Reskinning isn't just for creatures, though. It can be applied to other obstacles and traps, as well as to treasures, spell-like effects, and magical items. Generally, anything mechanical can be described to better fit the theme and ecology of your adventure. Not only will this make stating your adventure easier, but it helps encourage greater player involvement and interaction because the threats characters face aren't as easily defined with system knowledge, but rely on player observation to evaluate. Building ecology and factions. Let me just see, nothing going on in the chat. All right. Consider the locations of faction, food, and water source and waste disposal. Not only because these create coherence, but they also define faction territories and offer ways to threaten or destroy the faction. Not everything needs to make ecological sense in a literal way of having food sources in a lair, but everything should have a place within the larger ecology of the location, meaning relationships with other inhabitants. Define the leadership, goals, and concerns of each faction, even if they are simply defined prey. Knowing the fears and price of a creature makes it much easier to determine how characters can enrage, befriend, trick, or distract it. A faction leader or other NPC doesn't need a lot of detail to come alive. A memorable physical characteristic, a few adjectives, and a sentence describing their price and fears is usually enough. For larger, more important factions, create an order of battle that lists its numbers, resources, and a few tactics it will use in response to likely threats or strategies. Don't feel bound by existing monster, spell, item descriptions because the internal coherence of your adventure is more valuable than fidelity to a manual. Existing statistics provide guidelines and models, but even in complex systems, they can be reskinned and used differently quite easily. Random encounters and random encounter tables are a key to dungeon design. Not only do they create time pressure, but they also introduce your factions and offer opportunities to encounter their representatives outside their lair. Whew. All right, good stuff in there. I don't think there's anything that I disagree with. I think it's all good advice. Coherence. The ultimate goal of ecology, theme, and layout is coherence. For both the game master reading it and the players who experience it, the adventure needs to feel connected to make sense as a whole. Creating a coherent adventure is a test of how well the aspects of layout, theme, and ecology blend at their edges and support each other, because despite the way this device is structured, they overlap and mix rather naturally. Coherence is especially important because the space is fictional and fantastical, meaning that visualizing it and understanding it require more imagination than visualizing a fictional real-world space. Design and description needs to work together to build some sense of plausible order, one with fantastical elements that depart from the real but which still contain internal logic. Coherence is hard to quantify as it accretes from other elements of design, but the goal is to create an adventure that's identifiable as a dragon cave rather than a cave with a dragon in it. I think that's a really important distinguishing thing, because I think we can often fall into the trap of we have a cave with a dragon in it, but it doesn't read as a dragon's lair or a dragon's cave. And I think if we're thinking about it, we really want those things to read to the party and everything as a dragon's lair or dragon's cave, and not just that it ends up kind of by happenstance or seems random that there's just a cave with a dragon in it. For the GM, coherence and consistency allow for greater ease in adding detail and provides an understandable whole, a narrative of the location itself that's easier to remember than disparate elements. For the players, coherence allows greater interactivity with the setting because there's an internal order to the location that they can unpuzzle. Another swig of water here. It's dry. It's dry in here. It's dry. Keying. Finally, let's try that again. Finally, the necessary preparations are complete. The mise en place of the adventure is ready. A map is drawn, factions prepared, rumors written, theme and initial situation ready. As a designer, you are ready to put them in the meat of the adventure, the keys that describe its fictional space and that the GM will rely on to run it. There's a lot of art to keying. It's a strange combination of technical and poetic writing. A good dungeon key must both clearly and efficiently convey descriptive information and inspire with evocative or poetic language. It doesn't just need to be clear to the reader, but must also offer sufficiently succinct and inspiring language for the reader to convey the description to players, who in turn will interrogate the description. Beware of formalism. While a repeated structure for each key can help game masters run an adventure, one that contains too many elements or underused elements is distracting. A key is still evocative, creative writing, not a mathematical equation. Don't use read-aloud box text. It distracts from room contents and disrupts the flow of the game master's natural speech. Start your description with the most important things in the space, dangers to PCs, followed by the most obvious aspects of the room. Be as concise as you can. Digressions and extraneous detail can make descriptions unusable. You only have a few sentences for each idea before it becomes confusing, and only a few of these paragraphs per room before the earlier ones are forgotten. Despite a shared need for concision, room keying is not technical writing akin to a computer code, architectural specifications, or a mathematical formula. You won't be able to include every detail, so the details you can include should be evocative and inspire the game master to fill in what's missing. Describe what's in the room, not what it used to be. Visible remnants of the past can be part of the description, but should be minimized unless it is relevant to the present obstacles in the location. Describe a space, not the characters exploring it. Unless some powerful, unnatural compulsion is at work, the players will decide how their characters feel about what they are seeing. So avoid ascribing emotions and especially actions to character. Don't start with, as you enter the door. Describe a space, not a scene. While inhabitants should be engaging in activities, this is part of the description of creatures, not the location. The location shouldn't be static, so the designer can't know the circumstances when the characters arrive in the room. Include senses other than sight when providing descriptions. Lighting conditions, temperature, sounds, and odors are powerful description and useful, easily understood clues. Make your rooms interactive. The more players interact with the adventure, the more they will be thinking about and visualizing it. Even dungeon dressing that is neither treasure or obstacle provides thematic context, makes future concealed treasures or threats more effective, and encourages players to spend time exploring. Beware of minimalism. Brevity is key, but the room key is the designer's best chance to share their imagined space with the game master, who will translate it to the players. Offering poetic, concrete details and specific words that leave a strong impression is the best way to do this. Finally, use a consistent tone and style of language. High gygaxy and bombast or humorous familiarity can both work, but switching between them frequently also switches the tone of the adventure and confuses the reader. And then it looks like there's a link here to a more in-depth look at room keying using 2019's, I think this is a 5e adventure, right? Descent to Avernus. Might be able to look at that. Where are we at on time? I actually got through that fairly quickly. Elfbait says it's an odd thing, evocative rooms versus using too many words. Well, the whole, I think though, Elfbait, is that when you're being evocative, it's not about how many words you use, but it's about using words that are very descriptive, that are very, that communicate a lot of imagery. So you want to, I think the idea here is you want to pick the most evocative, and I probably shouldn't use evocative in the thing, but you want to pick the words that are going to bring you really strongly image. You know, what can you say? You know, if you say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but if we're going to take particular words, like someone, like say for a smell, you might say it smells bad, and then go on and mention, okay, it smells bad. It smells like something maybe died in here, or something. You say that, or you can say you can use the terms putrid and acrid. There's an acrid, putrid smell. Those two words are probably going to bring more imagery into the mind of the party who hears it, at least worth a couple of sentences about what exactly it smells like. Could I write out a bunch of, okay, it smells precisely like this? Sure. and maybe I lose something because I want it to smell like corpses, and maybe people don't think of corpses as being acrid. I really haven't smelled corpses. I don't really know. But ultimately, I feel like I get more out of those few words in a fewer space, and it's still a stronger, more vibrant image than using more sentences. So that's really what it's getting at. So it's not about the words. It's maybe choosing your words with care to the ones which really have that the best image value in someone's brain when they hear it. Which words describe us are going to really fire off your imaginations in an interesting way. Obviously, you want it to match what you're talking about, but like you could say something as, it's all the colors of the rainbow, or you could say kaleidoscopic. Kaleidoscopic is, someone would say, well, that's not exactly all the colors of a rainbow. No, but I would prefer kaleidoscopic than writing out that other thing. And plus, then it lets each person kind of have it their own. Each dungeon master can take that and maybe have it run with it a little bit differently just from that one word, because it's really what does that word say to them, as opposed to me trying to tell them exactly what to say or what something means. Brian Smith says, I love making references to things that are not fully explained and tangential, like it smells worse than the yellow muckfish of the simmering banks. Just make some connections and stuff. Yes, I think they can get too far. I think you have to be careful. I think you want to be cognizant of what you're doing, because some of that's good, but if it gets too much, then suddenly you lose that coherence because people are like, I don't know any of these things. So it's great. I feel like if you can use it, and especially if you can find really good ones, right? Or I guess on the other hand, if they're really off the cuff, like you think in Star Wars when they show up, like, you smell, you're stronger than a Gundar. It's like, okay, I don't know what that is, but I guess it's really strong, so cool. But we can remember those ones and say Star Wars, or what does he say? Like pull the doesn't say stronger than a Gundar. It says like you could pull the whatever off a Gundar, or a nerf herder. But if you recall in something like Empire Strikes Back, if you go through the entire script, there's only a couple of things. They mention 3 of them, 4 of them maybe, right? It's not peppered in every line of people aren't constantly making references to all these different things. So yeah, coming up with a few of them is good. I mean, like everything, right? You want to use it in moderation, because in moderation, it'll be really powerful and fun. But yeah, use too much and you'll start to get a little bit of like, what are we talking about here? I'm trying to think of anything I don't really agree with. I mean, I'm definitely not a huge fan of read-aloud text. They make a strong statement. It's just don't use it. I would imagine that maybe some people find it useful, but I would agree with that one. The start of your description thing is interesting, because I tend to agree with this advice here. Start with the dangers to the PCs, followed by the most obvious aspects of the room. But I see a lot of layouts that don't do that. I see a lot of layouts that talk with the aspects of the room, and then at the bottom we'll have, and then after that we'll have, and there's some orcs in here and they're about to jump you. So that's kind of interesting, because that kind of matches sort of what I think of, what I feel like, but at the same time, I feel like from what I've read that maybe there's a different, some other way of thinking about it, because I don't see that as much as I would think, though I tend to agree with that. I tend to agree that, if there's an orc in front of the door, I want to know that first before I'm told about the couch that's behind the orc and what's on the couch. Ryan Smith says, gives you a foothold to call back or develop further situation calls for it. Oh, talking about making references. Yeah, I can. I absolutely agree. You just want to make sure that, if you're going to use them, you're just using them thoughtfully. You're not just throwing out lots of random stuff. You use it thoughtfully. I mean, you'd like to think a little bit that Chekhov's gun type thing, right? So you're going to mention, you could pull the ears off a Gundar, and that you'll see a Gundar later on, something like that. I mean, it doesn't maybe have to be, and there's somebody just developing the character. But I think the other thing to keep in mind, and this is definitely being written from hey, you are writing this adventure for other people, not just your table. That other thing of keeping in mind too, that people are going to be dropping this in their games. Maybe they don't want Gundars or yellow muckfish, or they don't have the simmering banks. So the more of those references you put in there also end up being things that GMs might have to excise. And then not only does it become useless to them, but it actually adds more work, because we have to go through and cross. No, we don't have any simmering banks. We don't have any muckfish. Or where we have muckfish, or we're fine with inventing muckfish, but I don't know anything called simmering banks, so I got to make up something else and put it in there and remember to do that. So it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, just in terms of if you're writing adventures for other people's consumption, it's for your own setting, go for it. Marcello says, text boxes help the GM to inform the situation the author had in mind. I think it's a bad idea to read it in the middle of adventure. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends. So the old school text boxes, you're just meant to come to the room, read this description. Then I think they try to transition in usage, at least for some people, at least definitely for me, it was more, let me read the text and then I will translate into what I want to say. And now I think we're finding some folks, I forget, I think that Dolmenwood adventure, that one we read a little while back, that intro one, whose name I'm forgetting, and other people are now just doing away with them entirely and putting more keywords and things, descriptors in there. I think for certain GMs like me, I think that's helpful. I think for other GMs, especially new ones, it can be hard. Not that it's not worthwhile, but sometimes in the moment you're maybe reading those descriptors and it's not coming together for you. If you have some text you can read aloud, that can kind of be a lifeline for you. Maybe there's a little bit of middle ground, but I think on the other hand, you might think, hey, you know what? This is how you learn. You just jump in and do your best. And if the players have questions, they can ask. And feel free just to kind of make it your own and not worry about what some exact text an author does. And if they're new, they might not know any other way. So they're just going to figure it out and go with this new method. Marcello says, maybe for tournament adventure, it makes sense. You want to keep a standard. Yeah, I guess. I wouldn't even think I guess it's really how you feel about tournaments. I suppose if we were doing like tournaments, competitive play, esports, e-dungeons, and it was super important that everyone had the exact same experience because we're rating them, grading them, and giving prizes. Maybe if it's just we're running them in kind of a tournament setting and it's just for fun, and each tournament or each table at the tournament, it doesn't really matter too much, then it might be okay. But yeah, a lot of stuff that is done for those kinds of reasons. Like, we didn't do this for you. We did this because we want to look at how it's going to be run in sort of an adventurers league, organized play, or tournaments or whatnot. All right, let's take a look. I guess we'll go check out this link. I don't think I have too much else to say. I think it's really good advice. I think it's specifically it's a little bit specific to if you are writing an adventure or use at other tables besides your own. But I think it's got some good stuff. I think like this, I think it would be really interesting and fascinating, a good study to take this. We mentioned, because someone mentioned 5-room dungeons in the chat, the kind of elements of the 5-room dungeon with this. And I think they can really help inform you. And I think it is good, even if you're writing it just for yourself. But I think sometimes you can be more loosey-goosey, whatever, because you're writing for your own brain. So however you communicate best to your own brain, do it. Whereas you have to be a little bit more formalized if you're trying to do this for other people. Well, there's some really good things here. I think the stuff about theme and thinking about the ecology and the factions and everything is pretty spot on. Let's look at this keying example. How long is this? Oh my gosh. Long. All right. Man, this might be too much for me to chew on with what's left of the chat today. Let's see. Nothing says, one thing I think is bad advice is the idea that you only need to make up history and background to the extent the PCs will see it. I understand they're trying to let DMs off the hook, so make your own dungeon seems easy. The unseen background is how the GM is able to improvise and answer unexpected player questions. Well, they did kind of cover this. They did cover this in the piece. But I think if you think about it, there's probably two types of history you can have in a space. There's sort of real history that's going to be practical and usable. And then there's history that's more for flavor for the GM. You see these things that here's this temple 10,000 years ago. This temple was built by blah, blah, blah. 5,000 years ago, this stuff happened. 500 years ago, this stuff happened. 100 years ago, this stuff happened. And here you are. And sure, maybe that stuff from 100 years ago is filtered in and we get some things, maybe the stuff from 1,000, but there's probably at some point, and of course, lots of things depend, that other stuff, not super important. It may make things more specific than you want them to be, because if you're creating this for somebody else might run, that stuff becomes more embedded in an implied setting that might not match what your game masters are doing. You're talking about how the great empire, the fish people that ruled the planet 10,000 years ago did this, and the person who's running this doesn't have a 10,000-year-old world-conquering fish people. Well, then what does that do for them? It doesn't do anything. And in fact, the more then you build on that, the stuff that they have to undo. Whereas the stuff in the more recent history, or maybe even recency is probably not the right word. What I think we want is the kind of knowable history, because you might have stuff in the dungeon architecture or statues or stuff that go all the way back to those fish people, in which case it has I guess maybe relevant. I think what it is cut down on the irrelevant history. It's sometimes nice. We might have a great story about Romulus and Remus and the founding of Rome, but reality is, if we're playing as Germanic tribesmen who happen to come into the ruins of Rome, we're probably not going to see much Romulus and Remus in anything. And even if we find, oh, look, there's an odd statue of these two wolves and these two kids, that's probably not enough to even make us want to know the history. And I think it is a good thing to keep in mind is let's keep it as much as possible to the stuff that's going to be relevant. We have so much time we're going to spend in prep. If we had to measure out, okay, we have 2 hours to prep this thing, or 4 hours, 4 days, whatever it is, let's stick to the relevant stuff, the stuff that's actually going to matter in terms of what the party's doing. And then the other stuff, we can have it, not have it, whatever. But remember, keeping in mind that this is talking about doing things for other people, then it's probably even a good idea to just not have that stuff in there, because there just ends up being stuff that it might not be, not only not be relevant, but literally be stuff that's just going to force somebody else to come in and change, edit, modify, whatever. Brian Smith says, replying to nothing, I took it as more of a warning against spending too much time writing history, since a reading DM might not be able to get it into the player's path. That's the other thing. Maybe you have this great 10-page intro to the dungeon. I might not even read it. I might just flip through it. Oh, look at this. There's a 10-page intro. I don't care. It's not what I'm here for. Flip it. Or even if I do read it, I read it and then I'm not paying attention to it. So I think, yeah, they're just saying concentrate on the stuff that's going to be in the dungeon. Concentrate on the stuff that's actually going to have traces in there. If you get to it and you're like, well, yeah, a million years ago, a dinosaur lived in this cave. Are there bones there? Do we see it? Is it petrified in there? Nope. It's just the dinosaur was there. And then a cave bears and stuff came later. And then stuff came later. And now the goblins are here. Well, how much of that stuff is actually discernible? How much of the stuff is discoverable? Just the goblins and the cave bear. Then why are we worrying about the dungeon? What the dinosaurs? It doesn't matter. It doesn't add anything. It's just there. It's just taking up space, taking up maybe mental space. Maybe if you want to say, oh, but the GM can use this dinosaur thing to introduce something. Okay, but is even that useful? Because if it doesn't have anything to do with really what's at hand, am I just muddying the waters by bringing in like dinosaur stuff when really the important stuff is the goblins that if I'm going to start building up detail for and spend a lot of mind energy on, I want to spend it on the stuff that the players are interacting with, which is goblins, not long gone dinosaurs or whatever. Let's see. Brian Smith says tangible history. That's a good way of putting it. Yes, tangible history. Indeed. Elfbase says a lot of time you can feed the players not just the reference, but the relevance to them. Yes, this is true. Elfbase also says, I will be doing this in a campaign I'm just starting. The connection to the place is important to the campaign as it is about a party of dwarves saving their home. Oh, that sounds cool. So I'm pushing connection to that home and a sense of place and history. And Marcello reminding everybody, hey, please press the like before leaving. Thank you, Marcello. You're doing you're doing a yeoman's job. You're doing my job. Yes. Before you leave, if you are leaving soon, yeah, pressing the like button would be great. Another thing says your right point applies to making things for yourself, not so much for others. But I stand by the idea you should not only make things the PCs will see. I think as long as you know nothing. I think ultimately, what are we running an adventure for, right? It's for the GMs to guide something to the players. I do think that the most important part of an adventure is what the players will see and what the GM, and giving the GM levers and things that the players are going to see and interact with. So that other stuff, while it can be nice, while it certainly can add some stuff, I'd want to pay attention to how much is this being reflected in the stuff that they're interacting with. And if it's important enough to me to write 10 pages about, if it's important enough to me to spend a lot of mind share thinking about, then maybe I should look at how do I get this to be more relevant? Okay, I really want those 10,000-year-old fish people thing. Like, that's really important to me. I just feel like I got to have it. then the next thing I should think about is, okay, well, then we do a little bit from reverse. Okay, so it's really important. I want it to be important, so let's make it something and make sure it is there. Something about it, is relevant, is discoverable, kind of what's there. Because otherwise, it is nice kind of backstory, but it's that kind of that part where you're just writing a short story about a place, and that can be fun and it can be fulfilling. But the further away from you that gets, just be ready that people are going to go like, I don't care. When that drive-through RPG review goes, hey, great module, but the author spent 10 pages talking about fish people that have nothing to do with the module itself. I wish they'd spent those 10 pages on fleshing out X, Y, or Z. Then there you go. Yeah, you're right. I wanted you to have it. We just got to be at the same time, okay, be understanding that, yeah, maybe most people, don't want it. Maybe they don't want my 10 pages on the fish people and where they were and what they were doing and what they ate and all that stuff. But it may be a call to action to nothing is to make that stuff discoverable. I'm not sure why you would literally want stuff that the players can't find out. I mean, wonder what or either can't find out or is just irrelevant to them, just doesn't enter in it. Because I would think that everything I would want in there, I'd want the party to be able to appreciate in some way. Or are you suggesting it's just for the GM? This is just for GM enjoyment, just GM backstory, I guess. But I'd love to hear more about that because it's definitely an interesting point of view. But like I said, this is kind of made from a, hey, you're writing an adventure for other people. For yourself, go to town. And maybe for other people too. I don't know. But I feel like most people, I get the sense that most people, if they had the choice of 10 pages of purely optional, not really relevant kind of backstory stuff or more content is relevant and stuff, would probably go for the more content. But it might be down to how good a storyteller you are. All right, I'm scrolling through this thing on Room King. It seems really cool. Maybe I'll have to come back to this. It is just way long, which is kind of cool because it's going into a ton of detail and referencing other things, but there is no way I'm going to have time in a few minutes. Oh, nothing. Look at that. Good man. Take it to the forums, nothing. Yes, definitely write out your thoughts in the forum. I will be able to read it and reply, and you can go more long form. And if you're wondering what the forums are, I just open them up. Someplace for better discussions, be united. One thing I've found is that you folks are kind of scattered all over the place. Some people, some of you will, communicate via YouTube, and others will hit me up on Twitter, whatever. But they're all platforms I don't really have a ton of control over, and they don't all have really great functionality for talking and communicating in certain ways, right? 200 character limits, or there's no real way to break out things. The community, there's no way to sort of at people on the community tab if you're not a YouTube channel with so many viewers, right? No one can really at you and all that great stuff. So I have forums now. It's forums.hex.press. I'm hoping it can kind of be my hub. I'm not going to ignore or stop using any of the social media things, but at the same time, that's where I'm going to concentrate on more long form response and things, because it has the best space and formatting and all that. It's also where the Appendix N stuff, when we start talking about Turgeon of Mir and the other stories coming up in the Appendix N, that's kind of the main place I'm going to push people to get into more discussion. So go there if you'd like. It's kind of in beta, so I'm sort of, I have to go through and manually approve folks. But if you're interested, go there and approve. It's quiet, and part of what I'm doing is just going to be kind of that slow buildup of things getting posted there. So I hope some of you folks will help me out and post up there to help me sort of build it out so it doesn't look like it's just me posting into the void. But if it is, it is. So be it. And there's some right at the end. We get some more spam. Where is Nightbot? Too busy working for people posting in all caps to worry about actual spam. Come on, Nightbot. Do better. All right, folks. So we're just about at the end of an hour. Make it a nice hour. Glad we got through this. This Descent into Avernus Dungeon King seems super interesting. Let me know if you feel like you're really interested in it and I should read through it, or if you feel like we've had enough of this. That's fine too. I could go either way. It seems really interesting, but I could just myself, or I can do it and share it with all of you. So let me know about that. Where is he posting? Where's who? Oh, walking the path. He's posting on the forums. I will share. That's probably a good idea. Let me just go there now. I will share it. Where am I? So I post topics for everything. Here's the topic for this. Along with my, you see my first aborted attempt. Then I put another reply in there. There's the link. I didn't have time to make a short link for it. Oh, Brian Smith, you do want 10 pages of ancient fish people. Time to start the blog. Absolutely. That's something where I feel like you could have in an appendix. Like if you finish your thing and you're going to print it out and you realize, oh, I've got 5 extra pages that I need to fill out to get to a certain threshold for this kind of book type or booklet or whatever. Appendix A, the history of the fish people. So we got that. You're welcome, walking the path. If you, I will try to check in. If you do try to make an account right now, just know that you have to wait for me to manually approve it. I will go check it out in a few minutes, and that way I can approve you toot sweet right away if you want. Of course, that goes for everybody else as well. I try to check it fairly often to see when new users trickle in so I can approve and get folks in there. But that's all I got. So yeah, take it to the forums, take it to the comments, wherever you can find me. I am here. I am here for you. Tomorrow, I presume, will be the OSR Reddit roundup. So until then, enjoy the rest of your day, night, whenever you're watching or listening to this. Game on, and I'll talk.